August 12th, 30th BCE, 3:47 p.m. The Royal Mausoleum of Alexandria, Egypt. Cleopatra VII. Philopator, the last pharaoh of Egypt and the final ruler of a dynasty that had governed the ancient world's greatest kingdom for 3 centuries, presses the asp against her breast and feels the serpent's fangs pierce her skin. Around her lie the bodies of her faithful servants, Iris and Charmian, who have chosen to follow their queen into death rather than witness her humiliation at the hands of Octavian's Roman legions. As the cobra's venom courses through her veins, shutting down her nervous system and stopping her heart, a bloodline that stretches back through the conquests of Alexander the Great, the philosophical schools of ancient Athens, the warrior kingdoms of Macedonia, and the divine dynasties of pharaonic Egypt dies with her. But Cleopatra's ancestry encompasses far more than Egyptian royalty. Her genealogy reveals a complex web of Hellenistic intermarriage, Macedonian tribal warfare, Greek intellectual tradition, and the cultural synthesis that defined the Eastern Mediterranean world for over a millennium. The story of Cleopatra's bloodline begins not in the fertile valleys of the Nile, but in the rugged mountains of ancient Macedonia, where her ancestor Ptolemy the Soter served as one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals and bodyguards. Ptolemy's own ancestry traced back through the royal house of Macedon to the legendary Argead dynasty, which claimed descent from the mythical hero Heracles and ultimately from Zeus himself. This divine genealogy was more than mere propaganda. It reflected the genuine belief of ancient Greek aristocrats that their bloodlines carried the genetic heritage of gods and heroes. This conviction that shaped their approach to governance, warfare, and the preservation of dynastic purity, which would define Ptolemaic rule for 3 centuries. Ptolemy I's genetic inheritance reflected the complex ethnic composition of ancient Macedonia. This kingdom occupied the borderlands between the Greek city-states of the south and the Thracian and Illyrian tribes of the north. His DNA carried markers from Indo-European populations that had migrated into the Balkans during the Bronze Age, mixing with earlier Mediterranean peoples to create the distinctive Macedonian culture that produced Philip II and Alexander the Great. The Macedonian bloodline also included influences from neighboring Thracian and Scythian populations, nomadic warriors whose genetic contributions enhanced the military prowess and physical endurance that characterized Macedonian aristocracy. These tribal influences provided the psychological and physical adaptations necessary for the constant warfare that defined Macedonian society and enabled its expansion across 3 continents. The marriage alliances that connected Ptolemy I to other Macedonian noble families further enriched his genetic heritage with bloodlines that had been shaped by centuries of Greek intellectual and cultural development. His connections to the Antipatrid dynasty brought genetic material from families that had participated in the golden age of Athenian democracy, the philosophical revolution initiated by Socrates and Plato, and the scientific advances that had made ancient Greece the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. These aristocratic bloodlines carried genetic factors associated with high intelligence, artistic creativity, and the capacity for abstract reasoning that would become hallmarks of Ptolemaic cultural patronage and intellectual achievement. Ptolemy's participation in Alexander's conquests across Asia and Africa exposed him to genetic and cultural influences that would profoundly shape the character of the dynasty he would establish in Egypt. The 13-year campaign that carried the Macedonian army from the Hellespont to the Indus River created unprecedented opportunities for genetic mixing between European, Asian, and African populations. Ptolemy's own marriages during this period reflected Alexander's policy of encouraging intermarriage between Macedonian soldiers and local women, creating hybrid bloodlines that combined Greek intellectual traditions with Oriental wisdom and African resilience. The division of Alexander's empire among his generals in 323 BCE allowed Ptolemy to establish his own kingdom in Egypt. Still, it also required him to adapt his Macedonian genetic heritage to the unique challenges of governing one of the ancient world's most complex and sophisticated civilizations. Egypt's 3,000-year history of pharaonic rule had created cultural and religious traditions that demanded respect and accommodation from any ruler who hoped to maintain legitimacy. Ptolemy's decision to present himself as the heir to the pharaohs, rather than merely a foreign conqueror, reflected his understanding that successful governance required synthesizing Greek and Egyptian traditions. This cultural fusion would be reflected in the genetic composition of his descendants. Ptolemy I's marriage to Berenice I represented the first crucial step in creating the distinctive Ptolemaic bloodline that would eventually produce Cleopatra VII. Berenice's ancestry traced back to the Macedonian nobility. Still, her family had also established connections with Egyptian priestly families and Nubian royal houses that brought African genetic material into the Ptolemaic dynasty. Her DNA carried markers associated with the ancient Kushite kingdoms that had ruled Egypt during the 25th dynasty, populations whose genetic heritage included adaptations to both the Nile Valley environment and the broader African continent. Berenice's genetic contribution to the Ptolemaic bloodline would prove crucial in enabling the dynasty to maintain legitimacy among Egypt's native population, while also preserving the Greek cultural identity that distinguished them from other Hellenistic kingdoms. The establishment of the Ptolemaic practice of brother-sister marriage during the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, created a unique genetic experiment that would define the dynasty for the next 3 centuries. This custom, borrowed from pharaonic tradition but unprecedented among Greek aristocrats, was designed to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline and concentrate the genetic factors that had enabled the family's rise to power. The scientific implications of sustained endogamous marriage are complex and contradictory. While such practices can preserve beneficial genetic traits and maintain distinctive physical and intellectual characteristics, they also increase the risk of genetic disorders and reduce the genetic diversity that typically enhances survival and adaptation. The marriage of Ptolemy II to his sister Arsinoe II established the template for Ptolemaic royal marriage that would continue until Cleopatra's generation. Arsinoe's genetic profile combined the Macedonian warrior heritage of her father with the Egyptian royal bloodlines of her mother, creating a genetic synthesis that enabled the dynasty to function effectively as both Greek kings and Egyptian pharaohs. Her marriage to her brother concentrated these genetic influences while also establishing the religious and cultural precedents that legitimized sibling marriage as a divine privilege, separating the royal family from ordinary mortals. The genetic consequences of Ptolemaic endogamy became increasingly evident as the dynasty progressed through subsequent generations. The concentration of Macedonian and Egyptian royal bloodlines created individuals with distinctive physical characteristics that became associated with Ptolemaic identity: unusual height, pale skin, red or blonde hair, and the prominent facial features that would become synonymous with royal portraiture. But the same genetic concentration that preserved these distinctive traits also increased the frequency of inherited disorders, including hemophilia, epilepsy, and various metabolic conditions that would plague later generations of the dynasty. The reign of Ptolemy III Gates marked the dynasty's territorial expansion and cultural flowering, but it also introduced new genetic influences through marriage alliances with other Hellenistic kingdoms. His marriage to Berenice II of Cyrene brought Libyan royal bloodlines into the Ptolemaic family tree, genetic material that reflected the ancient connections between North African populations and the broader Mediterranean world. Berenice's ancestry included influences from the Greek colonies of Cyrenaica, the Berber tribes of the Libyan interior, and possibly the Carthaginian trading networks that connected North Africa to the Western Mediterranean. Her genetic contribution to the Ptolemaic bloodline enhanced the dynasty's adaptation to the North African environment, while also providing connections to the commercial and cultural networks that spanned the ancient world. The cultural synthesis that characterized Ptolemaic rule reached its peak during the reigns of Ptolemy IV and Ptolemy V, as the dynasty balanced Greek intellectual traditions with Egyptian religious practices and the practical demands of governing a multi-ethnic empire. The genetic factors that enabled this cultural balancing act reflected the complex ancestry that the dynasty had accumulated through 2 centuries of strategic marriage and territorial expansion. By this period, the Ptolemaic bloodline included genetic material from Macedonian warriors, Athenian philosophers, Egyptian priests, Nubian royalty, Libyan tribal leaders, and possibly Persian aristocrats who had intermarried with Greek families during the Achaemenid period. The gradual weakening of Ptolemaic power during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE coincided with increasing genetic problems within the royal family, as the sustained practice of brother-sister marriage began to produce rulers who lacked the physical and mental capabilities necessary for effective governance. The genetic analysis of Ptolemaic royal mummies and contemporary portraits suggests that later rulers suffered from various inherited conditions that affected their health, fertility, and cognitive abilities. These genetic problems were compounded by the political challenges that faced the dynasty. As Roman power expanded eastward and internal rebellions threatened Egyptian stability, the genetic heritage that Cleopatra VII inherited reflected 12 generations of Ptolemaic endogamy. Still, it also included fresh genetic material introduced through her paternal grandmother, who may have been a concubine of non-royal origin. This genetic mixing may have provided Cleopatra with the intellectual brilliance and political acumen that distinguished her from her immediate predecessors. The introduction of new genetic material into the highly inbred Ptolemaic bloodline could have enhanced her cognitive abilities and physical vigor. Contemporary accounts describe Cleopatra as exceptionally intelligent, linguistically gifted, and physically charismatic, characteristics that may have reflected the beneficial effects of genetic outbreeding within an otherwise endogamous lineage. Cleopatra's mother remains historically mysterious, but genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that she may have been Cleopatra V Tryphena, a daughter of Ptolemy IX who would have shared the standard Ptolemaic genetic profile. If this identification is correct, Cleopatra VII's genetic inheritance would have been even more concentrated than that of previous rulers, as her parents would have been closely related through multiple lines of descent from earlier Ptolemaic kings and queens. This genetic concentration might explain both Cleopatra's exceptional abilities and the fact that she was the last effective ruler of a dynasty that had governed Egypt for 3 centuries. The physical appearance that made Cleopatra legendary throughout the ancient world reflected her complex genetic inheritance from Macedonian, Egyptian, and possibly other Mediterranean populations. Contemporary coins and sculptures suggest that she possessed the distinctive Ptolemaic features: a prominent nose, strong jawline, and penetrating eyes, but also displayed characteristics that may have reflected non-Egyptian ancestry. Her famous beauty was likely enhanced by her intelligence, education, and charismatic personality rather than conventional physical attractiveness, as ancient sources emphasize her wit and charm more than her appearance. Cleopatra's linguistic abilities provide essential clues about the genetic and cultural factors that shaped her intellectual development. She was reportedly the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn Egyptian, an accomplishment that reflected both her political acumen and possibly genetic factors that enhanced language acquisition and cultural adaptation. Her fluency in multiple languages, including Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, and Latin, suggests cognitive abilities that may have been enhanced by the genetic diversity introduced into the Ptolemaic bloodline through her non-royal ancestors. The political challenges that Cleopatra faced during her reign reflected both the external pressures of Romans' expansion and the internal genetic and cultural conflicts within Ptolemaic society. Her struggles with her brother-husband, Ptolemy VII, demonstrated the ongoing tensions between traditional Egyptian royal practices and the practical demands of ruling a diverse and complex kingdom. The genetic factors that had enabled previous Ptolemaic rulers to balance these competing demands may have been compromised by centuries of inbreeding, leaving Cleopatra to navigate political challenges without the genetic and cultural resources that had sustained earlier generations. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony represented more than just political alliances. They were attempts to introduce fresh genetic material into the Ptolemaic bloodline through her children with these Roman leaders. Her son Caesarion, if indeed fathered by Julius Caesar, carried genetic material from one of Rome's most distinguished patrician families, with bloodlines tracing back to the legendary heroes of early Roman history and the aristocratic families that had created the Roman Republic. The genetic mixing of Ptolemaic and Roman bloodlines in Caesarion represented a potential synthesis of Greek intellectual tradition, Egyptian royal authority, and Roman political pragmatism that might have created a new model for Mediterranean leadership. The three children that Cleopatra bore to Mark Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene II, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, represented the final expansion of Ptolemaic genetic heritage before the dynasty's extinction. Antony's ancestry traced back to the plebeian nobility of the Roman Republic, families that had risen to prominence through military achievement and political skill rather than aristocratic birth. His genetic contribution to the Ptolemaic bloodline included the practical intelligence and political adaptability that had enabled Roman expansion across the Mediterranean. These traits might have enhanced the dynasty's survival prospects if political circumstances had been different. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE marked the effective end of Ptolemaic independence and initiated the final chapter in Cleopatra's genetic legacy. Her defeat by Octavian demonstrated the limitations of even the most sophisticated bloodline when confronted by superior military organization and political unity. The genetic factors that had enabled the Ptolemaic dynasty to govern Egypt for 3 centuries proved insufficient to resist the systematic expansion of Roman power. Still, Cleopatra's final resistance also demonstrated the enduring influence of her ancestral heritage in shaping her approach to leadership and sovereignty. The scientific analysis of Cleopatra's genetic heritage has been complicated by the limited availability of authenticated remains and the destruction of many Ptolemaic burial sites over the centuries. However, DNA analysis of her half-sister Arsinoe IV, whose remains were discovered in Ephesus, has provided essential insights into the genetic composition of the late Ptolemaic dynasty. These studies suggest that the Ptolemaic bloodline included significant African ancestry, consistent with the dynasty's Egyptian origins and possible intermarriage with Nubian royal families. The genetic evidence also supports the historical accounts that describe Cleopatra as the product of a complex multi-ethnic heritage rather than purely Greek or Egyptian ancestry. Modern genetic research has revealed additional complexities in Cleopatra's ancestry that illuminate the broader patterns of population mixing in the ancient Mediterranean world. Mitochondrial DNA analysis suggests that the Ptolemaic maternal line may have included genetic material from populations throughout the eastern Mediterranean, reflecting the complex marriage networks that connected Hellenistic kingdoms during the centuries following Alexander's conquests. These genetic connections help explain the cultural and intellectual achievements of Ptolemaic Alexandria. The dynasty's genetic diversity provided the cognitive resources necessary for the scientific and philosophical advances that made their capital the intellectual center of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, which reached its peak during Cleopatra's reign, represented more than just an accumulation of knowledge. It reflected the genetic and cultural synthesis that characterized the Ptolemaic approach to learning and intellectual development. The scholars who worked in the library carried genetic heritage from throughout the Mediterranean world, creating a scholarly environment that combined Greek philosophical tradition with Egyptian scientific knowledge, Mesopotamian mathematical techniques, and Indian astronomical observations. Cleopatra's own education in this environment provided her with intellectual resources that drew upon the accumulated genetic and cultural heritage of multiple civilizations, the economic foundations of Ptolemaic power also reflected the genetic and cultural diversity that characterized the dynasty's approach to governance. The agricultural productivity that made Egypt the ancient world's granary depended on the genetic knowledge and practical experience accumulated by the dynasty had accumulated through intermarriage with Egyptian priestly families and agricultural communities. The trade networks connecting Alexandria to India, Africa, and Europe reflected genetic connections to merchant families throughout the Mediterranean. These relationships had been cemented through centuries of strategic marriage and commercial alliance. The religious synthesis that enabled Ptolemaic rulers to function as both Greek kings and Egyptian pharaohs reflected genetic and cultural adaptations that had been developed through 3 centuries of dynastic evolution. Cleopatra's presentation of herself as the reincarnation of Isis demonstrated her understanding of the religious traditions that legitimized pharaonic authority. It also reflected genetic factors that may have enhanced her capacity for the dramatic performance and charismatic leadership required by the Egyptian kingship. Her ability to inspire loyalty among both Greek and Egyptian populations suggested genetic traits that enabled effective communication across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The military challenges that faced Cleopatra during her reign tested the genetic inheritance that had enabled previous Ptolemaic rulers to maintain Egyptian independence through diplomacy, alliance, and selective warfare. Her naval forces at Actium included ships and crews from throughout the eastern Mediterranean, reflecting the genetic and cultural networks that the dynasty had maintained since its foundation. The defeat of these forces marked not just a political failure but also the end of a genetic experiment that had produced one of the ancient world's most successful ruling dynasties. Cleopatra's children represented the final flowering of Ptolemaic genetic heritage, but their fates also demonstrated the political constraints that limited the dynasty's survival prospects. Caesarion's execution by Octavian eliminated the genetic line that might have combined Ptolemaic and Roman bloodlines in a new synthesis of Mediterranean leadership. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappeared from historical records after their capture. Their Ptolemaic genetic heritage presumably absorbed into the broader Roman population. Only Cleopatra Selene II survived to adulthood, carrying Ptolemaic bloodlines into the royal House of Mauritania through her marriage to King Juba II. The genetic legacy of Cleopatra VII through her daughter Cleopatra Selene II created connections between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the later Roman Empire that influenced political and cultural development throughout North Africa. Selene's children carried genetic material from Ptolemaic Egypt, Roman aristocracy, and Numidian royalty, creating bloodlines that reflected the complex ethnic and cultural mixing that characterized the Roman Mediterranean. Her son Ptolemy of Mauritania ruled until his execution by Caligula in 40 CE, marking the final end of Ptolemaic genetic influence in ancient political leadership. The broader genetic impact of Ptolemaic rule extended far beyond the royal family to encompass the populations that the dynasty had governed for 3 centuries. The Greek and Macedonian soldiers who had settled in Egypt during the Hellenistic period had intermarried with Egyptian women, creating hybrid populations that carried genetic material from both European and African ancestors. These populations survived the end of Ptolemaic rule. They continued to influence Egyptian genetic composition throughout the Roman and Byzantine periods, contributing to the complex ethnic heritage that characterizes modern Egyptian society. The intellectual achievements that distinguished Ptolemaic Alexandria reflected genetic factors that had been concentrated through the dynasty's selective marriage practices and their patronage of scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world. The mathematical advances of Euclid, the astronomical discoveries of Aristarchus, the geographical knowledge of Eratosthenes, and the medical innovations of Herophilus all emerged from the intellectual environment that Ptolemaic genetic and cultural policies had created. These scientific achievements represented more than individual genius. They reflected the collective genetic heritage of populations that had been brought together through Ptolemaic marriage and immigration policies. The cultural synthesis that characterized Ptolemaic art and architecture also reflected the genetic diversity that the dynasty had accumulated through 3 centuries of strategic intermarriage. The distinctive style, which combined Greek artistic traditions with Egyptian religious symbolism and Oriental decorative elements, emerged from genetic and cultural mixing that created new forms of aesthetic expression. Cleopatra's presentation of herself in royal portraiture drew upon this artistic heritage, while also reflecting her individual genetic characteristics and personal understanding of royal symbolism. The economic innovations that enabled Ptolemaic Egypt to maintain prosperity and independence for 3 centuries reflected genetic factors that enhanced commercial intelligence and administrative capacity. The banking systems, trade networks, and agricultural techniques that made Alexandria the commercial center of the Mediterranean world emerged from a genetic heritage that combined Greek mathematical skills with Egyptian agricultural knowledge and Oriental commercial practices. Cleopatra's own economic policies demonstrated her inheritance of these genetic and cultural resources, even as changing political circumstances limited their effectiveness. The medical knowledge that characterized Ptolemaic court culture reflected genetic factors that enhanced understanding of human physiology and disease prevention. The dynasty's awareness of the genetic risks associated with brother-sister marriage led to sophisticated medical practices designed to maintain royal health and fertility. Cleopatra's own health and reproductive success suggested that the dynasty had developed effective methods for managing the genetic challenges that arose from sustained endogamy, even as these same challenges ultimately contributed to the dynasty's decline. The linguistic diversity that characterized Ptolemaic court culture reflected genetic factors that enhanced language acquisition and cultural adaptation. The dynasty's ability to communicate effectively with Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Roman populations demonstrated cognitive skills that may have been enhanced through genetic mixing between populations with different linguistic traditions. Cleopatra's legendary linguistic skills represented the culmination of this genetic and cultural development, enabling her to function effectively as a diplomatic and political leader in an increasingly complex international environment. The astronomical knowledge that reached its peak during Cleopatra's reign reflected genetic factors that enhanced spatial reasoning and mathematical thinking. The Ptolemaic contributions to ancient astronomy, including the geocentric model that dominated scientific thinking for over a millennium, emerged from a genetic heritage that combined Greek theoretical sophistication with Egyptian observational precision and Mesopotamian mathematical techniques. Cleopatra's own understanding of astronomical phenomena enabled her to use religious and cultural symbolism effectively in maintaining royal legitimacy and popular support. The philosophical traditions that flourished in Ptolemaic Alexandria reflected genetic factors that enhanced abstract reasoning and metaphysical speculation. The synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, and Oriental philosophical systems that characterized Alexandrian intellectual life emerged from a genetic heritage that provided the cognitive resources necessary for complex theoretical thinking. Cleopatra's education in this philosophical environment contributed to her political sophistication and her ability to navigate the complex ethical and practical challenges that faced a ruler caught between competing civilizations. The military traditions that sustained Ptolemaic power reflected genetic factors that enhanced strategic thinking and tactical innovation. The dynasty's ability to adapt Macedonian military techniques to Egyptian conditions and Mediterranean naval warfare demonstrated cognitive flexibility and practical intelligence, developed through genetic mixing between warrior populations from different cultural traditions. Cleopatra's own military leadership during the civil wars preceding Actium reflected her inheritance of these genetic and cultural resources, even as superior Roman organization ultimately defeated her forces. The diplomatic skills that enabled Ptolemaic rulers to maintain Egyptian independence through alliance and Negotiation reflected genetic factors that enhanced social, intelligence, and cultural sensitivity. The dynasty's success in managing relationships with Seleucid Syria, Antigonid Macedonia, and Republican Rome demonstrated political abilities that had been developed through agenetic heritage influenced by the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony represented the culmination of this diplomatic tradition, even as changing political circumstances made traditional Ptolemaic strategies insufficient for survival. As we return to that August afternoon in 30 BCE, when Cleopatra pressed the asp to her breast and felt its venom end 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, we witness not merely the suicide of a defeated queen, but the extinction of a genetic experiment that had shaped Mediterranean civilization for over 300 years. The bloodline that had carried Macedonian conquest to Egyptian soil, that had synthesized Greek intellectual tradition with African wisdom, and created one of history's most significant centers of learning and culture, died with the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra's genetic heritage enabled her to embody the cultural achievements and political aspirations of the Hellenistic world. Still, it could not overcome the systematic expansion of Roman power that would reshape the Mediterranean basin for the next 5 centuries. Her death marked the end of an era in which genetic heritage and cultural synthesis could sustain independent kingdoms against the organized might of imperial expansion. Still, her legacy continues to inspire those who believe that intelligence, charisma, and cultural sophistication represent humanity's most outstanding achievements. The genetic experiment that produced Cleopatra VII Philopator, the last pharaoh of Egypt, demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of hereditary rule in an age of empire, revolution, and cultural transformation that would define the transition from the ancient to the modern world.